Aloha, welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii's focus on education movers, shakers, and reformers, interviews with guests that have special insight into education from preschool, K through 12, and higher education. I'm Jim Shon, your host. We're streaming live every Wednesday at noon, and today's show is devoted to mediation versus confrontation at the university. And my special guest is Bruce Barnes, who I have known for many years, graduate of the law school, Peace Corps volunteer, someone who now has been working with the Matsunaga Institute of Peace, involved with mediation, involved with resolving issues. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Since your theme is education, I thought it might be useful for us to start with the little kids. You know, and Hawaii has quite a reputation actually around the United States for conflict resolution, and you call it expertise. So beginning with the littlest kids of all, we were one of the first groups in the country that started creating manuals and did trainings in the elementary school, the middle schools, and the high schools. And Kaimuki Intermediate happened to be one of the very first places to really get the ball rolling. And shortly thereafter, other states started picking up the ball, and they started making videos and everything like this of little kids, you know, in the 3rd or 4th grade. 2 of them paired up. They were using a lot of the Hawaii model, the way that we teach the kids to do mediation. They were walking around with a little t-shirt saying conflict manager on the front. Even these little tiny girls, 2 of the girls would be ganging up with couple of football players, you know, and they would be fighting over who was gonna, they were just shooting baskets, and they were fighting over who was gonna get to use the basketball the most. And of course, these are younger kids. And so the little mediators would walk up to them and they would just start going through the drill. They'd have the opening statements and everything the way we do it with adults. And it was just amazing. It worked, and the little kids. So one of the things that I heard from Sue Chang, who is one of the pioneers of this whole thing, and she's been doing it for almost 30 years, running these peer mediation trainings, is that she said, you know what? After we did these trainings in the schools, we started coming around 2 months later, and the kids were bored. And they said, oh, this is too easy. There were no more conflicts on the playground. It was just amazing, you know, and so that kind of put us on the map back in the beginning of the conflict resolution movement or mediation movement too. Of course, this was usually mediation that they were doing. The kids.
So how did you get drawn into this? You're a graduate of the law school.
Well, I was actually on the neighborhood board in Makiki, and when the Mediation Center of the Pacific got started. And we were plunked by Mayor Fossey back in this little room. They brought trainers out from Georgia, and they did a first training, and they said, hey, you guys want to be mediators? We said, what's that? And so this is what it all started with in 1978. We had a little shack where they used to store all the implements for the gardens in Makiki Park, and that became the very first Makiki Mediation Center in Hawaii.
And when did it transfer itself onto the university?
Oh, well, that's a very long, you know, there's a lot of long stories in between there, I guess.
Maybe shorten them up a little.
Yeah, the Mediation Center, that Mediation Center itself had to go through a lot of evolution, first of all. I mean, so we initially visualized that center as serving the community primarily, but we began to get requests for trainings in other places, in other parts of the world even, and of course then they started thinking about, well, what kind of a center is this going to be? Luckily, we organized the Mediation Center the Mediation Center for Honolulu, very close connections with the judiciary. So that was a very wise move in our case, because other centers like in San Francisco tried to avoid lawyers at all costs, like lawyers were the plague or something like that, you know, and so, I think, you know, as I can explain later, is that I think we made the wise move in being well connected with the judiciary and the lawyers, because to this day they have supported us to the nth degree at the Mediation Center of the Pacific, now it's called.
I see. So there's a connection with the courts. Certain judges might say, why don't you sit down with a mediator and see if you can solve this dispute? Right. There's that. But now you're at the university with the Matsunaga Institute for Peace, right, and doing it mainly as a kind of resource service to the community, or how does that work?
Okay, well, let's move forward into the way that, I want to say a couple more things about the Mediation Center of the Pacific, if that's all right. Because we weren't just serving the community, the local community. We certainly weren't serving only Makiki. And there were judges on the neighbor islands as well. And of course, the neighbor islands had problems too. So we had to spread out. And we morphed into the Mediation Center, Mediation Centers of Hawaii, which I was the president of for, 2010 up to 2020. Not there yet. Anyway, for 10 years. And so we now have booming centers, 4 major centers, or 5, 2 on the Big Island, Maui, Kauai, and Oahu. So they had to go through that evolution as well, mediation. It became better known. Let's see, what else? And then we began to branch out into other types of conflicts. Okay, and this is for adults, so we kind of have to bounce back and forth.
Okay.
Because we haven't gotten to the university yet. All right. All right. So, do you have any questions about the Mediation Center of the Pacific, first of all, before we move on to the UH?
It's a private organization, really.
Nonprofit.
Nonprofit.
Private, right.
People would go to them if they knew about it for conflicts perhaps before it got to court or something more serious?
Yeah, and also for most people might have encountered a mediator from the Mediation Center of the Pacific when they went to small claims court. Nowadays, you're almost required, and the judge will look at you and he'll say, have you talked to the mediator yet? There's a mediator rating right over there on the side, from the Mediation Center of the Pacific. If they say no, then he said, please go talk with them, and you get a very accelerated version of mediation where a regular mediation might go 2 to 3 hours, whereas the small claims mediations go for maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes.
I see.
And then if they're not able to resolve it, then they go back to the judge.
But I see. Yeah.
So the judges all over the state are very supportive as well, which is one of the reasons why the center hasn't had to struggle too much to get funding, like for the basic staffing that you need for each center. And we'll come back to that in the context of the university as well, because one of the goals, like that we talk about a lot in the Matsunaga Institute is, can you have a functional system to do mediation? That was the first thing we tried to do.
I see.
And also Mediation Center of the Pacific was in that business of doing that because they had, a dozen employees or so all over the state that it was required to run all these mediation centers.
So a big organization like the university, it sounds like there's enough going on there that justifies having mediation right there on campus devoted to that institution. Is that?
Okay. Now we'll let you bring over. We've taken those little kids, those little tiny kids, and the big tall football player, and we're going to now transform them into freshmen and sophomores at UH Manoa. Right? Okay. We'll do that. Okay. And so we brought over our so-called experts that were the first. We call ourselves the dinosaur class of mediators. 1978, John Barkey, David Chandler, and a few others who had been mediating forever. And I called him the barefoot mediator around David Chandler around the University of Hawaii, because he would just kind of walk into people's offices, faculty, and say, would you like to talk about something? And he knew, of course, there was a conflict going on. And so there were those things going on, but of course, the more important people are the students. And so is it possible, the next question that we ask ourselves is it possible to set up a mediation program that will serve students? Well, at this time, this was 20, 30 years ago, a lot of universities, BYU, others, BYU and Utah, other schools, had fairly large mediation and even arbitration, but mostly mediation programs for students. Because the logical place you go is you go to the residence halls. That's where they're living, right? And they also are usually required to sign a contract with their roommate, a roommate contract. When they move in, well, a lot of the students are too busy, you know, partying and whatever to do that. And it leads to problems, misunderstanding. One of them is a slob, they leave their dishes, dirty dishes or whatever. And so we thought, well, let's do what these other campuses are doing in the mainland. Let's set up mediation centers here, maybe in the residence halls, or maybe working through ASUH. Of course, you're familiar with ASUH, of course. You know, they're the political arm of, you know, undergraduate students. And so we had real interesting experience. So we tried this 3, 4, or 5 times with ASUH. So they would fund it for 1 year. And luckily, these people have all left the university, so I won't be naming names, but one of the leaders had appointed his girlfriend as the ombudsperson. That didn't even last for more than a couple months. And of course, at the end of each year, you had new officers in there, so then you'd have to go and somehow figure out how to retrain them. So this is one of the big problems of mediation systems in universities, basically, is that students come up, they graduate, and they leave.
So you were training what you might call peer mediators.
Right.
Of their own generation, their own status, to work with them. I mean, not unlike the peer educator programs in the high schools to some extent.
Right.
But so this turnover is one of the big challenges for peer mediation, essentially. Then.
Not only peer mediation, well, yeah, for universities, right? I mean, the Mediation Center of the Pacific, during the time of the Clinton administration, we were also getting tons of contracts, Tracy Wiltgen and others, to go out and train the military bases, and even in Asia, the Asian military, U.S. military bases there. And then that went boomingly. It was a source of income, too, for the Mediation Center, which was really nice. But then all of a sudden, that presidential order got cut off. So all that business was gone. All those people we had trained on the centers as well had the same problem because they were turning over too. These people would go in service, they'd go out on, you know, on leave somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that was the similar problem that the universities had as well.
Fascinating. We're talking with Bruce Barnes, who's been involved with mediation at the grassroots level and at the university level. And we'll be back in a moment to talk more about what makes a good mediator.
To Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy on Wednesday. And we have Sharon Moriwaki, my co-host and co-chair of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum. And we have Warren Bohlmeyer today, a special guest with the Hawaii Renewable Energy Alliance, and also a member of the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum.
In fact, he's our Renewable Energy Working Group Chair. So he takes care of all of our...
You ought to see him in song and dance, too. He does the musical part of the show. Sharon is more serious than that, but not much more serious. So anyway, what do you think of this show? I mean, is this good?
I think this is good. We hope it's good. We hope it attracts a lot more people than our forum, so that people can see what's going on in energy and clean energy, and call in, write in, tweet,
yeah, we
or
want
Twitter.
that. We want public engagement, civic engagement from everybody, because that's the only way we're going to get down the road on this, right, Warren?
Yeah, I think so, and it's an opportunity for guys like me to share a little bit of their mana'o and sometimes get the facts right. Who was that guy that said, just give me the facts, you know, start with the facts and then work from there? Oh, it was Dragnet guy, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
Jack,
That was when I was just
I
in grade school then. I
remember
barely
that.
remember that.
just the facts,
Just the
man.
facts.
Here on Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday from 4 to 5. You'll see. Come back soon. Right, Sharon?
Great.
Warren?
Yes.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Today's show is about mediation versus conflict, with a little bit of an emphasis on the university. We're talking with Bruce Barnes of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace, and runs a certificate program, trains, selects mediators. I wanted to ask you, Bruce, what makes a good mediator? If you know, you just go, anybody want to be a mediator? What do you look for? What are the skills you want to develop in someone who would be effective?
I think all of us you know, at the university and Mediation Center of the Pacific, we're pretty looking for a wide variety of people, but the skills that we emphasize the most are probably listening, ability to listen carefully, you know, the things that we cover in the basic mediation courses. Don't interrupt people constantly. You know, I mean, that's not a good thing for conflict resolution. Then we teach them communication skills like open-ended questions, like reframing, learning how to do reframing. You can actually reframe yourself out of a bad situation or back into a better situation if you have these skills, which are not always obvious to most people in the world or in students or workplace either, for that matter.
So at the UH, how many people are actively engaged in mediation? You have volunteer group or what?
Well, again, we were talking about having a conflict resolution system. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we found out over the years, I think I was alluding to this fact, that we were having trouble keeping these mediation or operations going because of the constant turnover. And so I mentioned, you know, one way was to use ASUH, you know, the ASUH, the student body organizations, which didn't seem to work very well. Their funding was so uneven. Mm-hmm. You know, it would be only 1 year out of 10 would we ever have any funding for the students. And so we tried running it right out of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. That was another thing that we tried. And we went over to the housing departments again because we wanted to serve students above all, or I mean as much as anything else. And what we found was that they didn't have time. They're like schools. They're like K through 12 schools. They have to teach 4 million different other things. They have to bring in the people that are going to talk about security on campus. You know, it's a huge thing at UH Mill. You know, talk about women's rights, you know, about ethnic groups, ethnicity, all this kind of stuff. How you can, you know, how you can deal. They had other people that were like basically psychological backgrounds. So if a student was having psychological problems, they could go see one of these counselors. But that's not the same thing as mediation. Mediation, you're getting two people together, you know, to try to work better on solving their problems.
Can you mention some of the more well-known or intense conflicts that the mediation group has been involved with at UH?
Okay. Well, of course, these are all confidential. So we cannot mention people's names
Just talk about
or anything like that. But in the first years, and we had a grant, luckily, from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for about, I don't know, 8 to 10 years, which was very helpful. So that got us money to do training and all these kinds of things. And so a typical kind of conflict that we might have been involved in, well, we could have gotten involved in, we did get involved in grade disputes between graduate students, and maybe there was a professor that they had to go through to graduate, and they were having, this professor just said, no, that piece of work. I remember one that was involving in the field of arts. You know, arts is very subjective, you know, what one person may think is good art and one person is not. And then I remember one case which was very difficult that we tried to mediate, and it was very hard because the professor was very stubborn. So one of the things we learned from that is that professors don't like to be mediated. We would use 2 mediators at a time. So if there was a student and a professor conflict, just like at the Mediation Center of the Pacific, we try to use co-mediators. So it would be logical, you would think, that we could use a professor that would understand the professor's side, yes, and a student that would understand the student's side. But it didn't work that way because most of the professors think that, you know, they're up there above reproach, and who could ever dare to question their authority? And so that particular mediation wasn't that successful. But I'm trying to think of any. Oh yeah, I remember one where we did with all the student body presidents of different campuses, and that was very successful. You know, I mean, because I think we did that with co-mediators, with, you know, a professor and with a student, and they just had trouble working out all their problems working together. You know, they were all into power. I guess at that point they were probably future members of the legislature or something like that. I don't know.
So let's move up into sort of like faculty and administration. Have you been involved at all with some of those sort of mega issues that hit the university and hit the papers and?
Yeah, well, you know, I'll just throw out a few names of people that we've been working with or that are aware of these things. And of course, everybody's aware of these four conflicts that I'm going to name in a few
Okay,
minutes.
name them, yeah.
Maybe I should start out by naming them. We call these wicked conflicts, you know, and in the field of negotiation and conflict resolution, because they're so complex and so many moving parts and so difficult. Could be political, could be cultural, could be you know, money, all about money. It could be any or all of the above, or personalities. And so, you know, if you think back to the last probably 2 years or more, and these have all been in the media. They all involve UH Manoa.
Okay.
And of course, there are many on the other campuses as well that you
Yeah.
don't hear about so much, but one of them was firing a tenured full professor who was a bully, which took 15 years. Now, we weren't involved in a lot of these or directly or even because 15 years, how many people came and left? That's one. The campus center, which most people are familiar with. There was different levels and, you know, all kinds of issues raised during the course of that. And it was, you know, in the blogs and the media and everything. And of course, this is the one that everybody catches the most, is the sporting, you know, the sports departments, hiring of athletic directors, coaches, related conflicts, and of course there's what's the musician? The Wonder Blunder. The Wonder Blunder, that's the most famous one of all.
Right.
That led off one of the tracks, you know, and people have all different ideas about all of those. Let's see, is there one more? And now Mauna Kea, you know, and also Haleakala is entering the picture. So, so these are some of what I would call the wicked disputes. I mean, they're going to be around. Some of them have been around for a long time, and they're going to be around maybe for a lot longer. And so, well, anyway, what's your question? What's your next question?
So one way in which institutions deal with the wicked disputes is to create an ombuds office. An office that's devoted to sorting out these conflicts and increasing communication among stakeholders to the big issues. You've been very much an advocate for actually recreating an ombuds office at the UH. So what the heck is an ombudsman?
Yeah. Okay, an ombuds, here's their job basically. Okay, they do communications, of course. Communicate. And again, we did have an ombuds office roughly from 2009 maybe through 2010, about 2.5 years. Okay, Neil Milner was the ombuds, just for people that may not be familiar with that. And then we had two ladies that I was head of the hiring committee. Susan, oh my gosh, it even slipped out of my mind. Anyway, they're now both active ombuds people on the mainland. So they're being, you know, both being very successful because this office was closed for financial reasons, apparently. So an ombuds office is responsible for communications, improved communications between people. They do a version of mediation, but not as intensely. They don't rely on bringing the two people in together at the beginning, like the Mediation Center of the Pacific does, necessarily. It's even possible for an ombudsperson to be meeting with, let's say, a department chair and a faculty that are having problems without either of them knowing it. Because it's so confidential, you know, and then maybe they'll bring them together later on if they're both willing, because quite often the people are just not even willing to meet. And so all of these ones that we mentioned, they involve chancellors, deans, you know, directors.
Can you say Apple? Which is a kind of famous,
that's one, yeah, that would be number 5 on my list, yeah.
Yeah, it's something, do you think that kind of an issue where you had stakeholders who felt they didn't know what was happening or why it was happening, that an ombudsman could have contributed to helping that situation?
Yeah, yes, I think, very broad statement, very difficult to answer, you know, because in fact, that's the only time in our history that we've ever had an ombuds office that was responsible to all of UH Manoa and to the students and to the faculty and to the administrators and to the green shirts. The green shirts are the guys, you know, this wall is green if you didn't know that, but they're the ones running outside, you know, cleaning up the grounds and all this kind of stuff, you know, and they all have unions for openers. So there's another big, you know, big impact
So it's a
on
kind of
any conflict.
clash of the titans of stakeholders at that level. Not so much really personal, but bigger issues like that. Cancer Center,
Right.
you know.
And one of the last things that most people don't realize is that an ombuds office also does an annual report. Now, mostly those things sound boring and people just throw them away. But we can take them, for example, in 2009, I think their first year in service, their annual report said basically, and this is the truth. I mean, you know, I think it's still on their, they haven't even closed their website down yet. I don't know what's up with that. But on the website, it'll tell you, if you go look at it, that they've come together with all these 300 people that came through their office in that year, and they're looking for trends. And so they're now, of course, they don't, it's totally confidential. But then your annual report, in that case, the first year, it was reporting already, they were off and running, and they were saying, you know what? Most of the people, you look at the statistics, they have problems with financial aids. Well, you know, as they would say in the undergraduate world, duh. You know, I mean, everybody in financial aids has well, not everybody, but a lot of people have conflict. But at least now the administration is aware of the trends.
Right.
Because when I talk to people now, I don't think they are. A lot of them, they're not getting the right information. And the graduate students, I think you're aware of this, they were out testifying at the legislature many times, many different levels, that they don't have any place to go. They don't have a union, you know, and so that's just symptomatic of the whole campus, I think, I'm afraid of, really.
So there's this notion of the voice of stakeholders that probably would never get in to see President Lasner or the Chancellor or the Board of Regents one-on-one, that this is a place to go.
Right.
where the power guys, they don't have time for you, and they can actually analyze the data, tell you where the trends are, and maybe tell you more about your institution than you would ever have time to know. Is that, I know that was some of the testimony at the legislature this year to try to recreate the Ombuds office.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the interesting things, I mean, I've been pouring through this book. It's called, that way, it's called The Organizational Ombuds. And this tells a lot of the stories about the old pros, you know, and how they do these things when they resolve conflicts. Oh my gosh.
Well, the fact that somebody has put this kind of thing together means that the idea of creating an ombudsman is not a new thing.
Right.
There's a lot of data, a lot of information. There's even information in here, I understand, that shows how you save money by injecting a mediator ombudsman into a conflict before it gets too intense, yeah?
Yeah, right. And so all of these wicked disputes, you know, okay, maybe we'll come back to Apple. I hope I don't get in trouble on this one, but I felt sorry for him when he went over and tried to fire, you know, the then director of the Cancer Center, because he had just stepped off the plane, literally, you know, in just a few months. And so one of the things that ombuds offices do, which was surprising to me when I first read this book, is that not only do they give advice, you know, and counsel to students, but also not only to professors and to deans, but also to presidents of universities. And so this is why longevity is so important, because at our level of chancellors, we don't have continuity. 2 years, you know, Apple's one of them, and then boom, we're into the next one. So there's nobody that has that institutional memory. The union will tell you, you know, that they're the only ones that have a statewide memory of the university system, because they've had filed grievances from everybody and their dog on every campus over the last 30 years.
And
but that's not a viable system to manage conflicts.
I do recall the previous, when Neil Milner was there, I believe he gave reports to the Board of Regents and there's a turnover there as well. So that institutional memory, the trends, that seems to be an important aspect of any complex organization like the UH, yeah?
Absolutely. I mean, this feedback, they call it, in the ombuds world, they call it upward feedback.
Upward feedback.
Yeah, and it's going, anybody, like I said, you can go and open it up now. The report that they wrote, you know, what, 5 years ago? And of course, the Board of Regents gets the same thing everybody else does. So they're being kept aware at the same time. It's confidentiality, there's confidential, so they'll never release the names of the people, and they write it in such a way you can't tell.
Yeah.
You know, who the parties, I mean, they just won't do it. Like they still to this day, they won't tell me whether they were there, you know, in the cancer center thing. You know, I kept bugging them saying, well, what's going on? They wouldn't do it.
This is fascinating. We're talking with Bruce Barnes, who's involved with the Matsunaga Peace Institute, mediation, and a long-term advocate of an ombudsman at the university. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I host Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii, and I do this because I care about science literacy in Hawaii. I want to spread the understanding that science is a vital and interesting part of everyone's life. I want to make sure the broadest possible spectrum of people understand the beauty and the value of science and realize that science plays out each and every day of their lives. I want you to understand that science is fun. So we bring onto this show each week guests who are scientists, from astronomers to zoologists, and we talk about what they do and how they do it. But most importantly, we talk about why you should care about their work, why you should see that their work has value and impact on your life. So I hope you'll join us Fridays, 1 p.m. here on ThinkTech Hawaii. You can watch us via live stream. You can watch us recorded on Olelo, and you can see us each week. We hope you'll join us.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Today's show is mediation versus conflict at the UH, the usefulness of mediation, and the ombudsman. We're talking with Bruce Barnes, long-term mediator, leader in this movement, and an advocate of recreating that office of the ombudsman at the University of Hawaii. And we were just talking about some of the issues in the past that an ombudsman might be able to have addressed, maybe more intelligently, copacetically, respectfully. But if we're talking about creating an office, what are we talking about? We're talking about one guy or a woman in a closet? Are we talking about a staff? What's an adequate staff? From your perspective, what would be a really good, rigorous, effective office? What would it look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question, of course, and we're hoping through the last legislature we managed to, you know, rack our brains about this issue a little bit, and with the advice from the two ladies that are now, practicing ombudspeople on the mainland, we learned that we could get by with, for Manoa only. See, this is a huge issue. This is always an issue, it seems like, when you're going to provide services to the UH. Are you going to only provide it to Manoa, or are you going to provide it to all the other 9 campuses, you know? And so this is where we kind of got off the track a little bit during the last legislative session, because we knew the university didn't have money. Didn't have money to fund that, and yet, but yet the rules, what's called the International Ombuds Association has guidelines, and their guidelines say that you should report in the Ombuds office. One of the most important things of all is that they report to the highest possible office, which in our case is the president's office. But yet, when they created the original one, they had a position within the chancellor's office, because Denise Conan at that time was the interim chancellor, and she had just kind of set it up with her own money so it could get running, which is kind of the position we're in now. You know, we really don't have money to start up one. So, so that's one of the issues. And then, like I said, because of the numbers, we have the numbers from 2 years, how many people are going to come through the door. So we can figure that if you had 3 ombuds people, that would be sufficient for Manoa. Now, Manoa is always calling itself the most important, campus in the world, but, I keep saying to a blank wall, I guess, is like, what about the other 9 campuses? I know they have conflicts that are almost or as wicked as these are. It's just that they don't get on the blogs. They don't get on the blogs, they don't get on the evening news very often unless it's really something horrendous. So, I mean, so that's kind of a, other than that, they need an office that's set off to the side.
For confidentiality.
Yeah, you don't want it in the middle of all the traffic.
Yeah.
So they had a pretty good situation last time. It was off to the side of the campus center. And so most students wouldn't normally go through that building. They didn't even notice it, which is what you want. So, I mean, it's not that complex, really, to set up the office. It's just a question of money, I guess, mostly.
I guess one of the important elements of this is that ombudsman and their office be independent, not part of the hierarchy. Don't look at this, you better look at that. They have to be free to really look at anything that comes in the door and an issue that they might want to initiate an investigation of. Is that the way you see?
Well, okay, now we're getting a little tangled up between the different definitions of ombuds offices because, and this is something that I don't think very many people in the state of Hawaii are even aware of. And of course, we were one of the first states to ever have a state ombuds office.
Right.
They operate very differently from a organizational ombuds, again, remember. Mm-hmm. Now, the state ombuds office has about 8 or 9 investigators. This is all they do practically full-time is investigate. Mm-hmm. Now, they can go on their own initiative and investigate at the University of Hawaii or any other state agency in the state of Hawaii, all right? There's only one, as lawyers say, there's one caveat, and that caveat is if the union is already involved, then they won't touch it.
Oh, I see.
So this is the problem, only a problem with them. So in spite of the fact that they had the ability to come in on a lot of these conflicts, perhaps, and do an investigation, almost always, I think, as far as I know, all of those 3 or 4 have had, because the only other tool people have in the university is formal grievances that go through the union.
And having been an arbitrator, a labor arbitrator,
yeah. I
know how there's always a tendency to want to make that very legalistic, ritualistic, and almost like a court of law. And court arbitrators have to kind of temper the attorneys at the table for that. Mm-hmm. So I can see where that, when your only avenue of resolution is a formal, very legalistic, almost court-like environment, that's not a real great environment to solve problems in a collaborative way, I guess. Yeah.
And so what we've been talking about all this time, it has another name or initials, and it's ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. Alternatives to what? Alternatives to going to court.
Right.
And making your lawyer rich and your pocketbook a little bit thinner.
Yes, yes.
I mean, that's rather, that's not going to win me a lot of fans in the law school graduates that are looking for a job right now. But
so if you were going to set up your ombudsman office, right, and you said you might need 3 or so just to cover Manoa,
right.
Would that imply you probably need a staff of about 5 or 6 to serve the overall community of all the campuses? Even though it would have an office in one place, you probably would still have that interaction?
Yeah, I wish we had been, we've never had that conversation with a chancellor or the president of the university yet. We really hope and wish that we could do that. I think one of my goals would be, this is where Matsunaga Institute could be involved, I think, and that is that we would have graduate students, as interns working with it. First step is it takes 3 years to get certified by the International Organization of Ombuds people. You have to have been working in a in a IOA setting, following all their guidelines for 2 years before you can even apply to be certified under their system. Now, you can start out right away when you've got the basic training. You can be an ombuds already. but you're not certified. But I think we need somebody in Hawaii that's certified that can train the other people for the other campuses. So in our budget lineup, I think we had one central mediator, one central ombud, like something like the position that Neil held at Manoa, and then they would be responsible for training we had them budgeted as APT, I think, which is maybe about half of a full the head ombudsman is almost an administrator too. I mean, if you're running 10 campuses, it's not like the way it was running with Neil, particularly, So that's the kind of the dream, I guess, that we would have now, and hopefully we can convince the president that it's in his own interest. Actually, when you draw it administratively, it's a dotted line going up to the side over to the president. So they can't get sabotaged by any of those people. Any of those people could be mad at you for some reason, any of the chancellors or their assistants or anybody else. And as a matter of fact, in our research, I mean, I think I can say this, I have to say it carefully, but when they shut that down, when the chancellor, Virginia Henshaw shut down the ombuds office, I went looking for anybody that would have stood up and said, yeah, we're for it. Let's see if, let's go march and see if we can save the ombuds office. Nobody. All of the other agencies that dealt with it, I think, either they would say that we don't trust them, which was an interesting statement because they didn't, it was all confidential. Some of them, a few of them, of course I'm not going to name names here, a few of them said that we can't trust those people. And the other people said, like, they're too confidential. They'll call us up and ask us questions about, student X, and then the ombuds, and then the other staff person, I can say, like, for example, the other agencies are like HR. Human relations, they're the ones that start a lot of investigation. So that they should be working together. They weren't, none of them were working together. The ombuds office was not working with the legal office. It just goes on and on and on. So it was a disaster that wasn't going anywhere at the end, and it wasn't anybody's fault. It's just the way it turned out, I guess.
So you have administrators and units that probably don't enjoy the intrusion, but a lot of stakeholders, faculty, students, others, who can benefit by having a channel for their voice, a champion for their cause, to resolve the issue, and to really look at what's happening throughout that whole institution as far as trends. And it does seem to me with issues like Mauna Kea and others that are before the university, the constraints on an administrator to polish that apple, no pun intended, and make it look good for legislators or others, that can get in the way of actually resolving some of these issues. So I'm really glad you came on and talked a little bit about this whole issue of mediation, the ombudsman, and whether or not the university could really benefit from it. I think we both might conclude that it certainly could. So I want to thank Bruce Barnes for coming on for our focus on mediation versus confrontation. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, education movers, shakers, and reformers. We'll be back next week on Wednesday at noon. Mahalo.